J'ai demandé à nos adversaires de mettre fin aux hostilités. J'ai pris cette décision dure au cœur d'un soldat, parce que la situation militaire l'imposait.
The words you just heard horrified millions of inhabitants of Paris in 1940, the year when German flags bearing the infamous eagle of National Socialism began to flutter there. After the surrender, the capital of France became Adolf Hitler's playground. His men turned the City of Lights into a wasteland. The lack of food and fuel led the population into mass exodus, while German soldiers enjoyed ostentatious vacations. In this new installment of military history, we want to take you on a journey into the past, to learn about what life was like on the streets of Paris during the fierce occupation by the Third Reich. In September 1939, France began preparing for battle after the Third Reich invaded Poland, marking the start of World War II. At that time, for Parisians, armed combat seemed distant, thousands of kilometers away. The peace of the City of Lights and its bustling cultural life kept them oblivious to the approaching horror. The problem arose in May 1940, when German troops attacked France and easily defeated its army. The strategy of waiting and defending proved an utter failure, exacerbated by the fact that the army and political sphere were infiltrated by Reich allies.
The Germans continue their relentless advance southward. Considered the best army in the world before May 10th, the French army is now in shambles. And yet it put up a better fight than was thought. In 1 month, 100,000 French soldiers die, the nation's greatest death toll since the same period of time during World War I, the deadliest of wars until then.
The official government fled Paris on June 10th, leaving a void that was filled by Nazism on the 14th of the same month, marking the beginning of a tortuous and humiliating domination of the city. In this context, Philippe Pétain emerged as the local authority, prime minister of the so-called Vichy Republic, an absolute collaborator with Nazi Germany. Within this puppet state, republican institutions and fundamental freedoms were abolished. Additionally, trade unions and political parties were dissolved. Paris was governed by German military and French officials approved by the Third Reich. For Parisians, this period was one of profound anguish. The once vibrant cultural life was replaced by obscurantism and constant control of activities. A curfew was imposed from 9 in the evening until 5 in the morning, during which time the streets were deserted and patrolled only by police and the military. Lights were extinguished, transforming the famous city into a dark and silent wasteland. Simultaneously, France's primary resources were extracted for Germany's benefit. Metals, food, and firearms ended up in the hands of Reich troops. Meanwhile, Parisian citizens endured constant rationing, consuming meager portions of food, wearing the same clothes until they were worn out, and having minimal access to coal and other goods.
When the people of Paris come to the streets again, it is to hear the voice of dictators, telling them what they must do, how they must live, what they must say, what they must think, telling them how to be slaves. Gone is the Republic of France. Gone is free speech and a free representative government. Gone is liberty, equality, fraternity.
Due to the lack of fuel, the number of cars on the streets of Paris decreased from 350,000 before the war to just 4,500 during the occupation. This revived old forms of horse-drawn transportation, such as carts pulled by horses. Trucks and vehicles moving through the city generally ran on low-quality fuel. The metro continued to operate, but with significant interruptions, complicating the daily lives of workers. Hunger and cold were compounded by the necessity of moving around on foot, regardless of the weather. To grasp the chaos caused by the fuel shortage in the transportation system, in 1939, there were 3,500 buses in operation. The following year, only 500 remained in service. The consequences of these issues persisted for several years after the end of World War II.
French civilians, men, women, and children, must slave on farm or in factory for the Nazi master race, or starve. There will be a class of subject alien races. We need not hesitate to call them slaves.
One of the policies that frustrated Parisians the most was the STO program, or compulsory labor service, through which young French people were sent to work in German military factories to produce weaponry and other critical parts. In exchange, French prisoners of war captured during the 1940 advance were returned to the country. Healthy and energetic men left to enslave themselves to ensure the release of sick, hungry, and wounded soldiers. This was crucial in bolstering the ranks of the resistance, as Raymond Aubrac vividly recalls.
Ce qui est très important de noter, c'est l'importance de l'opération STO sur l'opinion publique. Parce que quand on mobilise 3 classes d'âge, toute la population est concernée. Par exemple, les paysans qui ont échappé à une partie des rigueurs de l'occupation, notamment pour les problèmes d'alimentation, et qui n'étaient pas tellement tournés vers la résistance. Le STO les a d'un seul coup basculés, en grande majorité, dans la résistance.
It's important to clarify that the attitude of Parisians towards the occupation varied widely. Some saw the Germans as a source of money, as soldiers arrived eager to spend their wages on entertainment. Later, we'll learn how this drastically and brutally changed the city's cultural life. The response of members of the French Communist Party was more complex, as the party had been denouncing Nazi racist and imperialist policies for years. The problem arose in 1939 with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the fleeting collaboration between Germany and the Soviet Union, putting communist militants in an uncomfortable position. Imagine the confusion of the time when the communist newspaper, L'Humanité, which had been shut down by the French government, received permission to operate from the new Nazi authorities. While many militants continued organizing independently, the French Communist Party remained neutral until 1941. After Operation Barbarossa and the definitive confrontation between Moscow and Berlin, they took a clearly anti-Nazi stance. By the time the Germans reached the capital, part of the population, particularly the wealthier strata, had fled to the countryside and less prominent provinces in hopes of escaping violence. This phenomenon was known as the Exodus of 1940, and thousands of French also crossed into Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. As Nazi domination policies became more aggressive, the poorer sectors decided to leave illegally, risking their lives. Without financial security and facing the uncertainty of homelessness, they fled to other nations. Meanwhile, Jews and other ethnic and religious minorities lived in separate ghettos, enduring daily humiliations by the invading force, legitimized by a collaborationist government. In Paris, Jews were forced to wear the yellow star on their arms, an identifying patch that practically excluded them from any activity on French soil. They were second-class citizens subjected to arbitrary punishments and beatings, not always by the German army, but often by Vichy police officers, the local collaborationist front. Though the Parisian case wasn't as devastating as the Polish one, there were cases of mass deportations in the French capital. For instance, between July 16 and 17, 1942, over 13,000 Jews were arrested by the police on Nazi orders. They were then loaded onto trains and transported to Auschwitz, where many died from execution or starvation. One of the most terrifying aspects of occupied Paris was the sound of sirens signaling raids and the closure of establishments. Those operating them weren't Germans but the French police, which was not friendly to the civilian population. While the French force has tried to cleanse its image regarding collaborationist accusations, it's clear that during the Reich's intervention, they were obedient partners. They conducted arrests and gathered information with violence and mistreatment, especially if there was suspicion of Jewish descent. The Germans lacked sufficient personnel to manage control and activities on French soil. Thus, local cooperation was crucial to suppress any form of resistance.
This was the price the French were to pay as they signed the armistice. And the master of the master race must go to Paris to tour the streets of what was once the City of Light. You notice no cheering crowds here to welcome in the new order.
The invasion was not just military, but also cultural and symbolic. Symbols of Nazism such as eagles or flags with swastikas were placed in every space. Parisian clocks were set to German time to coincide with Berlin time. In every detail, the territory was transformed into a subsidiary zone of Germany. The high military command of the Third Reich moved into the luxurious quarters of the majestic hotel on Avenue Kleber. Meanwhile, the military intelligence services were stationed at the Hotel Lutetia. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's Air Force, occupied the legendary Ritz Hotel. The Hotel de la Marine at Place de la Concorde was assigned to the Kriegsmarine, the National Socialist Navy. Thus, every luxury or tourist space became headquarters for the invading force.
For the German soldiers, the year 1940 will be the year of all pleasures. Klaus, the Berlin soldier, finally gets his first leave.
This is Paris, and this is me on the second floor of the Eiffel Tower. We had gone up to the second floor on foot. The elevators were out of order, and it was already very high.
Paris became the favorite vacation destination for German soldiers. Under the slogan, Jeder einmal in Paris, which translates to everyone once in Paris, every German conscript was promised at least one visit to the famous City of Lights. 1 month after the start of the occupation, a bi-monthly magazine was marketed that advertised the most interesting places for National Socialist tourism. This publication included a travel guide and directives on how to interact with locals, permitted areas for movement, and regional authorities that could be contacted. The hotels not occupied by high military command were allocated to accommodate traveling soldiers who took their long-awaited vacations after dedicating their lives to Adolf Hitler's cause. Gradually, the colors red, black, and white took over the French capital, imprinting the cold and austere German style and imposing their diet and customs in the bars. German beer and cuisine became the norm for several years. Regarding entertainment, cinemas became exclusive for permitted citizens or Nazi troops. The programming in these venues changed drastically. Successful French and American films, which had been highly sought after across the continent for years, were no longer screened. Instead, screens were filled with harsh images from German propaganda cinema, characterized by patriotic exaltation and a taste for visual opulence. For centuries, Paris had been a hub for art collecting and housed top-tier museums. The Germans understood the symbolic and monetary value of these treasures, but laws existed regarding the theft of artwork. While most soldiers respected the Hague Conventions signed between 1899 and 1907, the Nazi High Command was less considerate. On June 30th, 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered that all artistic pieces in France, whether part of private collections or state-owned, be safeguarded. This led to the emptying of museums and mansions where the wealthiest had safeguarded paintings of immense historical value.
Between 1941 and 1944, 29 convoys left Paris for the Reich. They represented a total of 138 wagons filled with 4,170 boxes. The greatest looting of artworks of all time.
Another aspect of entertainment during the German occupation of Paris was prostitution. Numerous brothels were militarized according to policies set by the National Socialist Party. The official stance of the Reich ensured that its men had guaranteed access to women to prevent any behavior deemed degenerate, particularly homosexuality. They also believed that contact with prostitutes was necessary to ensure the soldiers' performance in battle. The militarization of brothels was one of the darkest aspects of the Nazi presence in the French capital. These establishments operated in former brothels, occupied residences, and even synagogues, symbolizing disdain and humiliation towards Jewish culture and tradition. The women who lived there were often slaves or coerced employees. While they received minimal compensation for their activities, they had no other choice. Refusing to have sex with a German soldier could have deadly consequences for Parisian prostitutes. Unfortunately, after the war ended, civil society's reaction was brutal. Prostitutes who had been with Nazis were considered traitors and publicly humiliated. They were first shaved and had a swastika painted on their foreheads to denounce their crime, a mark of shame visible to all. In many cases, this escalated to physical violence, including lynchings. This post-war brutality is one of the strongest collateral effects of the German occupation in Paris. The City of Lights became, for several years, the lapdog of the German power. Soldiers walked freely, and enemy flags fluttered prominently in every square and monument, which had a significant psychological effect on the people. It was a historical period that required deep analysis to finally incorporate into the consciousness of every French person. Now, it's time to discuss those who disagreed with the collaborationist stance and tried to turn Paris into a beacon of rebellion against fascist advancement.
Like magic, weapons appeared. Under the nose of the Gestapo, they had collected enough to arm 50,000 of their men.
Over time, a portion of Parisians resisted the National Socialist occupation, although their effects were limited. The major achievement of this resistance was keeping the German authorities and the Vichy regime on edge, but the French rebels did not achieve decisive victories. Eventually, the concept of resistance became crucial to the country's history, serving as a way to channel the anguish of being occupied for years by the most brutal totalitarian regime in history. The existence of resistance, no matter how small or fleeting, meant that not all the population accepted the presence of the Third Reich. The first large-scale demonstration against the National Socialist occupation occurred on November 11, 1940, driven by Parisian students. From then on, activities became increasingly dangerous. For instance, in the spring of 1942, 5 students from Lycée Buffon decided to organize a protest against the arrest of one of their teachers. Around 100 classmates participated in the mobilization, and although most managed to escape, the National Socialist intelligence hunted them down. The 5 leaders who spearheaded the event were captured and executed on February 8, 1943.
Like a monstrous beetle from a dark hole in Berlin, this thing marched into the street, the symbol of Nazi power. But Nazi power was in its twilight. On the world's battlefields outside Paris, their beetles were being squashed. Parisians revolted, and the uncanny silences were broken again and again with the whistle of sudden death.
As the war continued and the two fronts, the Allies and the Axis, became more entrenched, various clandestine groups were created in the French capital. Some were loyal to the French Communist Party, others to General Charles de Gaulle, who organized the war response from London. The activities of the groups included attacks on military and police offices, the creation of graffiti alluding to the crimes committed by the Germans, and the demand for the slogan, "Liberty, Equality, and Fraternity." The turning point for the German occupation of Paris was the landing of the Allies in Normandy on June 6, 1944. This event allowed the advance of soldiers from the United States and the United Kingdom from the north of the European continent towards the French capital. At the same time, the Germans' control of the City of Lights was increasingly problematic. They no longer had enough personnel to enforce the harsh segregationist laws. Many of the soldiers stationed there had been sent to Italy or the Eastern Front to fight the Soviets. Little by little, the streets of Paris were filled with rebel locals who were in favor of liberation.
A French armored division drives on Paris. This unit of the Allied Army of Invasion has been ordered to battle its way to the capital of France, in which the patriot population has risen against the Nazi garrison. Fierce fighting in Paris, and there are sharp clashes as the rescue force pushes on.
On August 19, 1944, through a popular revolt, the French resistance stormed government buildings and police stations. On the 25th of the same month, Paris was finally liberated by a combination of local and American troops who made way for the arrival of General de Gaulle. It was he who led a triumphal march through the Champs-Élysées on August 26, 1944. Thus, one of the darkest chapters in the history of Paris was closed, although, as we anticipated, the after effects of that traumatic occupation were felt for years. This is how we come to the end of the video. If you liked this content, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.